March 1945, near Remagen, German POWs were shocked when American soldiers didn't even touch them. He was a Gefreiter in the 11th Panzer Division, bracing for the end. He expected a rifle butt to the teeth. He expected a kick to the ribs. Instead, they followed the rules. He had been told they tortured prisoners, but an American soldier simply handed him a bar of soap. This obedience to the Geneva Convention felt colder than rage. It was a weapon they hadn't been trained for. When an enemy offers you dignity instead of fists, is he trying to save your life or break something else inside you? Tell us where you're listening from, and the time there. We want to see how far these testimonies travel. If mercy and memory matter to you, subscribe to keep them alive. In March of 1945, near the German town of Remagen, the world was ending one muddy field at a time. For Gefreiter Karl Brenner of the 11th Panzer Division, the final command had been clear: fight to the last man. He was 19 years old, and the last man was not a role he wanted. Soaked to the bone and hollowed out by hunger, he and the others in his unit finally dropped their rifles. Karl had seen his SS cousins burn entire barns for a single defiant look. Now, standing with his hands raised, he watched the American soldiers approach, their muzzles steady. He braced for the blow that always came after a defeat, the one meant to remind a man he was no longer human. But it never landed. The German POWs were shocked when the American soldiers didn't even touch them. He felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. They were just boys in grey, no longer worth the bullets, but still worth something else he couldn't name. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and fear. Karl watched as the American line advanced, expecting the usual shouts, the boots, the spittle. Instead, there was a strange, disciplined quiet. An American medic, a man with tired eyes and a red cross on his helmet, walked down their ragged line. He wasn't looking for wounds to ignore. He was looking for men to help. He stopped in front of a soldier from Karl's unit and, without a word, handed him a small, plain bar of soap. The German soldier stared at it as if it were a grenade. A few feet away, a corporal unhooked his own canteen and offered water to another prisoner whose lips were cracked and bleeding. The first words Karl heard an American speak were not a barked command or an insult. The voice was low, tired, and directed at a boy who was swaying on his feet. The American just asked, "You okay?" In Karl's ears, the final warnings from his own officers still echoed with absolute certainty. The Allies torture prisoners. They humiliate you before they kill you. Surrender is a coward's death. But the reality in this muddy field was soap and clean water, and a question filled with a simple, unbelievable concern. It was a weapon they had never been trained for. The contrast was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The world he thought he knew was starting to crack. They were marched, not dragged, toward a holding area near the captured Remagen Bridge, the Ludendorff Bridge, as they knew it. A prize of war, now the backdrop for their surrender. Karl kept his eyes down, watching his boots squish in the mud, expecting the jab of a bayonet in his back to hurry him along. It never came. The prisoners walked at a steady pace, and the guards walked beside them, their rifles held low in a posture of control, not threat. The holding area wasn't what he expected, either. There were no cages, no electrified fences, no barbed wire designed to tear a man's flesh. There was only a simple rope perimeter, strung between wooden posts, marking the line between captivity and freedom. American MPs, soldiers from the 99th Infantry Division, paced the boundary with a calm that was more unsettling than any anger could be. One of them, a sergeant named James Avery, watched the new prisoners file in. His face was unreadable, his movements measured. He believed rules mattered more than emotion, and the rule here was the Geneva Convention. In that strange, quiet space, Karl witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A German soldier, his calf torn open by a piece of shrapnel, stumbled. His shoelace had come undone. Before anyone could react, one of the young American GIs knelt in the mud in front of him. The American didn't say a word. He just reached out, his hands moving with gentle efficiency, and tied the wounded man's shoelace. He tightened the knot, gave a quick pat to the man's ankle, and then stood up and walked away. A simple act of care, offered from an enemy to an enemy, in the middle of a war. This quiet mercy was more disorienting than cruelty. Karl had prepared himself to be an object of hatred. Instead, he was being treated with a detached, almost bureaucratic patience. They weren't even searched roughly. He saw another private, a boy named Huber who always had a foolish comment ready, start to mouth off to a guard. Karl tensed, expecting Huber to be struck down. But the American soldier just held up a hand, spoke a few firm words in English, and moved on. There was no violence. There was just order. It was worse than a slap. Karl would later try to explain it in a letter to his sister. He wrote, "It was as if they didn't see us as enemies anymore. Maybe they didn't see us as anything at all." The final moments of that first day cemented this terrifying new idea in his mind. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across the field, Karl watched one of the young American soldiers, a boy who couldn't have been any older than him, approach a prisoner who had been missed during the first pass. The GI held out another bar of soap. The German prisoner took it. Their eyes met for a second. The look in the American's eyes wasn't pity. It was something else. It was restraint. It was a conscious choice. He had the power to harm, and he was choosing not to. The soldier gave a small nod and walked away without another word. In that silence, Karl Brenner felt a foundation shift deep within him. The world was built on simple truths: us versus them, strength versus weakness, victory or death. But soap and water and a tied shoelace were not simple. They were complicated, and they undid everything. As he stood there, a prisoner of war under a darkening German sky, only one thought remained, clear and sharp. Everything he had been told could not be true. The first days bled into weeks, and the initial shock of capture settled into a strange, disorienting routine. Karl, along with thousands of other prisoners, was moved from the muddy fields of Remagen. They traveled by truck and by train, a river of grey uniforms flowing deeper into Allied territory. His destination was a place called Camp Ashcan, a high-level prisoner site established in the Palace Hotel in Bad Mondorf, Luxembourg. He was now just one of more than 325,000 German soldiers held by the US in the European theatre by the spring of 1945. In their minds, they were defeated men marching toward an unknown punishment. In the minds of their captors, they were prisoners of war, protected by a set of rules most of them had never heard of. The 1929 Geneva Convention was not a myth, it was policy. It stated that prisoners were entitled to humane treatment. It guaranteed them adequate food, medical care, and protection from violence. It even gave them the right to send and receive mail. But this was an abstract reality, a piece of paper from a world that no longer seemed to exist. The world Karl knew, the one he was trained for, was built on a different set of rules. For 12 years, since 1933, he and every other soldier in the Wehrmacht had been fed a steady diet of propaganda that insisted Allied surrender meant humiliation, torture, or death. SS political officers had given lectures on how the Americans mutilated their male prisoners. Karl believed it, because believing it made fighting to the last man seem logical. At Camp Ashcan, the propaganda died a quiet death. The prisoners were processed not by angry combat troops, but by calm American officers who sat at wooden tables with stacks of paperwork. There was no shouting, there were no blows. It was a simple, orderly procedure. Name, rank, serial number. Each man was a line item in a ledger, not an object of revenge. Inside the camp, the rules were firm, but they were also fair. Karl found it unnerving. Guards didn't bark orders, they gave instructions. One afternoon, driven by a morbid curiosity, Karl approached a guard during a quiet moment and asked, through another prisoner who spoke some English, where they kept the punishment cells. The American sergeant, a man with the weary look of a schoolteacher, just seemed confused. He frowned and replied, "You mean the infirmary?" It was a place for healing, not for breaking. The longer he was there, the more Karl saw that this bland politeness was applied to everyone. He saw senior German officers, men from the OKW, the High Command itself, being treated with the same distant respect. There was no special humiliation for the powerful, no special cruelty for the weak. He watched as American GIs actively avoided touching the prisoners unless it was to help them. One day, a guard noticed a German officer, an Oberleutnant named Dieter Wahl, who carried himself with a cold, unbroken pride, favoring his leg. The guard saw that a wound on the man's shin had become infected. Without ceremony, he retrieved a medical kit and carefully dressed the wound with fresh gauze. His movements gentle and professional. The Oberleutnant didn't thank him. The American didn't seem to expect it. This experience wasn't unique to the men. A Luxembourger civilian nurse named Anna Weber had been assigned to the camp. At 29, she had seen the cost of the German occupation up close. Her own brother had been killed during the Battle of the Bulge. Yet her duty was to heal, not to judge. In a letter to her sister in April of 1945, she wrote about the prisoners. "The Germans come in frightened," she explained. "Most are thin and grey. They flinch when we speak to them, as if they are expecting a blow. One boy, no older than my little cousin, even sobbed when I offered him clean sheets for his cot. He told another prisoner he thought we were going to poison them in their sleep." The myth of the brutal American captor was strong, but it could not survive the quiet evidence of clean linen, fresh bandages, and food from a shared mess line. Carl saw it every day. The prisoners ate the same gruel and bread as the American guards. This simple equality baffled him more than any act of kindness. A few weeks into his captivity, the old order made a final desperate stand. Oberleutnant Weil, the bitter officer with the bandaged leg, tried to organize the prisoners into a resistance cell. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones of their duty to Germany, even behind the wire. The Americans found out. Carl braced for a public beating, an execution perhaps to make an example of him. Instead, a few MPs calmly walked over to Weil, spoke to him in low voices, and escorted him away. He was isolated, his influence cut off, but there was no violence, not even toward him. Carl thought, they won't even hate the ones who deserve it. Then, on May 8, 1945, the world truly ended. An American officer announced it to the prisoners assembled in the courtyard. The Reich has fallen. The war in Europe is over. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, followed by a ripple of relief. It was finished. They had survived. But the relief quickly curdled into a new kind of fear. They were not freed. Their future was not their own. Repatriation, they were told, would take months or for some, even years. The rules of the Geneva Convention, which had felt like a shield, now felt like the bars of a cage. Rumors started to circulate. Dark whispers passed between prisoners in the dead of night. The American camps in France were overcrowded and rife with disease. The Russians were executing SS men on the spot. But here in Ashcan, nothing changed. The Americans held the line. Food, medical aid, and the slow, agonizingly censored letters to home. The systematic mercy, once so shocking, now began to feel like something else entirely. It felt like indifference. In a letter he knew might never arrive, Carl wrote to his family, "We surrendered expecting fists. We got soap, but now the world forgets us anyway." The doubt began to grow in his mind, a cold spot in his chest. Was this mercy real, or was it just a more efficient way to manage a problem? They didn't touch him. They didn't strike him, but maybe that was because he was no longer a man in their eyes. Maybe he was just a number on a list, an object to be processed, fed, and contained, no longer human enough to hate. The waiting finally ended in 1946. After nearly a year in American custody, Karl Brenner was released. He walked out of the camp a free man, gaunt but physically unharmed. The journey home to his village in Bavaria was a slow crawl through a broken country. He carried a small bundle of possessions and a much heavier weight of uncertainty. He did not know what he was returning to. He expected no parades, no medals for his service, but he hoped for a quiet welcome, a return to the life he had left behind. Instead, what greeted him was silence. It was a silence deeper than the one in the prison camp, heavier than the hush after an artillery barrage. His father, a man who once spoke proudly of Germany's strength, refused to speak of the war at all. He would look at Karl, his only surviving son, and then look away, his face a mask of unspoken grief and shame. Karl's older brother, a zealous member of the SS, had never come back from the Eastern Front. He was a ghost in their small house, a martyr whose sacrifice made Karl's survival feel like a betrayal. The unspoken question hung in every room. Why him? Why the one who laid down his arms? In post-war Germany, the lines between hero and coward were drawn in blood. Those who had died were praised in hushed tones as patriots who fought to the bitter end. Those who survived, especially the ones who returned from the relative safety of Allied camps, were treated as burdens. Whispers followed them through the streets. They were collaborators, weaklings who had traded their honor for a piece of American bread. Karl tried to explain. He tried to tell his family about the soap, the clean water, the unexpected orderliness of his captivity. He tried to describe the strange, powerful mercy he had witnessed. One evening, sitting with his uncle, a man who had lost his own son near Stalingrad, Karl made the mistake of saying the Americans had been decent. He said they followed rules. The words were barely out of his mouth when his uncle's face contorted with disgust. He spat on the floor at Karl's feet. The message was clear. To speak of an enemy's decency was to dishonor the German dead. No one wanted to hear his truth. His experience did not fit the neat, tragic story they needed to tell themselves about their defeat. It was easier to believe in American monsters than in American rules. So Karl learned to be silent too. He kept one item from his time as a prisoner, hidden away from judging eyes. It was a small, folded American field dressing, still in its sterile paper wrapper, unopened and unused. He had been given it by a black GI in Luxembourg, a soldier guarding a work detail. The soldier had seen a cut on Karl's hand, a small, insignificant injury. He'd stopped Karl, pulled the dressing from his own belt pouch, and simply handed it to him. No words were exchanged. The soldier had dark, weary eyes, and in that moment, he wasn't an enemy or a guard. He was just another man, far from home, offering a small bit of care to another. Karl never learned his name. But that quiet, unspoken offering the hand that reached out, without malice, lingered in his memory longer and more vividly than any speech, any battle, any order he had ever received. It was a concrete piece of a different reality. History would later record the statistics that Karl only knew in his bones. By 1947, over 3 million German prisoners of war had passed through American hands. Of those men, fewer than 1% had died while in US custody. In the Soviet camps, that number was closer to 30%. The 1929 Geneva Convention, a document Karl had never heard of until he became a prisoner, had held. It had not been perfect, but against all the hatred and exhaustion of a brutal war, the American policy had overwhelmingly been one of restraint, not revenge. In 1948, the silence began to break, but not in the way Karl expected. A young teacher in the local school, a woman dedicated to building a new Germany from the ashes of the old, learned that Karl had been a POW. She asked if he would speak to her older students about his experience with surrender. He almost refused. The memories were a private burden, not a public lesson. The shame his uncle had spat at his feet was still a fresh wound. But then he thought of the field dressing, of the soap, of the guard who had tied another man's shoelace. He thought of the American's quiet question, "You okay?" He went to the school. Standing in front of a room of children born in the war's shadow, he found his voice. He didn't speak of battles or glory. He told them about the mud, the hunger, and the fear. Then he said the words that had earned him his uncle's scorn, but this time they sounded different. They sounded like a discovery. "They didn't touch us," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Not with fists, not even with pride, just with rules. And that," he paused, looking at their curious faces, "that may have saved us." The years that followed were a quiet, steady effort of rebuilding, both for Germany and for Karl Brenner himself. By 1955, the rubble in his Bavarian village had been cleared, and new roofs dotted the landscape. The war was a scar on the land and in the minds of the men who fought it. Karl, now in his late 20s and working with the familiar patience of a radio repairman, found that the silence that had greeted his return had softened. People still didn't want to talk about the fighting, but they were learning to talk about survival. One autumn, he received an invitation to a small reunion for former prisoners from his region who had been held in American camps. He went, not out of a sense of pride, but of curiosity. He wanted to know if his memories were his alone. The men who gathered in the back room of a small guest house were not the hardened soldiers he remembered. They were mechanics, farmers, and clerks, their faces lined with the worries of peacetime. And when they spoke little of battles. No one boasted of their victories or lamented their defeats on the battlefield. Instead, they spoke of the camps. They spoke of small things that had loomed large in their world behind the wire. One man remembered a guard from Ohio who had smuggled them chocolate on Christmas Eve. Another described the first time he saw a guard get disciplined for shouting at a prisoner. They talked about the shock of being treated not as animals, but as a logistical problem to be managed according to a rulebook. Then, one of the older men, a former artillery officer, reached into his coat pocket. He carefully unwrapped a piece of old, worn linen to reveal a half-used bar of pale green soap. It was American issue, cracked with age. He held it in his palm for everyone to see. A few of the men laughed. A soft, gentle sound of recognition. No one had to ask what it meant. That simple object was a more powerful symbol than any flag or medal. This was our first freedom, the man said, his voice thick with memory. He wasn't talking about being released. He was talking about the first moments of captivity. The freedom to not be beaten. The freedom to be clean. Carl looked at the bar of soap and nodded. He understood completely. That small, unremarkable thing represented the moment the world had stopped making the brutal sense he had been taught to expect. It was the first piece of evidence that his captors were bound by something other than hatred. It was the first sign that he might survive not just the war, but the shame of surrender. To be treated with dignity when you expected none was a profound and unsettling liberty. Years passed. Carl married, had children, and built a life far removed from the noise of war. But the quiet lesson of his captivity stayed with him. He grew into an old man, and the world changed again. He was invited once more to speak to a classroom of high school students, a generation for whom the war was just a chapter in a history book. This time, he brought his small, hidden treasure with him. He stood before them, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled the old, folded American Field dressing from his wallet. The paper wrapper was brittle, the print faded, but it was still intact. He held it up. The students were silent, watching him. After he finished speaking, a young girl in the front row raised her hand. Her question was simple and direct, the kind of question only the young can ask. "Weren't you angry?" she asked. "Weren't you angry at the soldiers who captured you?" Carl looked at her and then at the bandage in his hand. He thought of the muddy field, the fear, and the guard with the tired eyes who had given it to him. He answered her slowly, the words shaped by decades of thought. "I was prepared to hate them," he said. "They were prepared not to hate me. That's the difference." He keeps the bandage packet and the memory of that soap in a small wooden box in his desk drawer. He doesn't tell his grandchildren stories of the battles he fought with the 11th Panzer Division. He only tells them about the quiet moments that came after, about the shock of not being touched, of being offered dignity when he was sure he had lost all right to it. It was the mercy of the enemy that allowed him to see his own reflection again. The rules, the soap, the restraint, they had not been a weapon to break his spirit. They had been a bridge back to the world. Mercy doesn't erase what we did, he would think to himself, running a thumb over the old paper of the bandage wrapper. But it gave me the chance to live with it,